They took the house. They took the truck. They took every dollar in the savings account before the funeral flowers even wilted. And they gave the orphan girl a rusted fire tower. The county valued it at $1. Dale Pruitt laughed about it at the reading, out loud, in front of the lawyer. "She got the tower," he said. "Good luck heating that with pride." Nora Kessler said nothing. She signed where the lawyer pointed. She folded the one page that was hers. She walked out into a Montana parking lot with a manila envelope and a key on a leather cord. 6 weeks later, she was climbing 80 feet of iron stairs in the dark, a flashlight in her teeth, counting rungs out loud, like a woman counting her own heartbeat. And when she reached the top, when she finally got the cab door open, the first thing she found wasn't gold. It wasn't cash either. It was her own name, in her grandfather's handwriting, dated the year she was born. But before the stairs, before the counting, there was a courtroom. A gavel. A laugh that hadn't finished echoing off the walls yet. The gavel had not even finished its second knock. Dale Pruitt laughed, loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. He said the old tower wasn't worth the diesel it would take to haul the scrap down the mountain. Nora Kessler was 17. She sat very still in the front row of the Larch Street courthouse. Her hands were folded in her lap, the way her grandfather had taught her to sit at church. She did not look at Dale when he laughed. She looked at the lawyer instead, a tired man named Greaves. He kept adjusting his glasses like they were the only thing in the room he could control. "The house," Greaves read, "the 2019 Ford F250, and the balance of the Bitterroot Hollow. Savings and loan account to Dale and Carol Pruitt, as guardians and next of kin." Carol Pruitt smiled the smile of a woman who had already picked out new curtains. She had Nora's late mother's eyes. That made it worse somehow. She looked so much like family. She acted like none at all. "And to Nora Jean Kessler," Greaves went on, "the fire lookout tower and a pertinent 1-acre parcel on Kestrel Ridge, Forest Service Road 214, currently assessed by Ravalli County at $1. That was when Dale laughed. Not a chuckle. A real laugh, from the gut. The kind of laugh a man gives when he thinks he's already won. $1, he said. She got $1 worth of scrap steel 80 feet in the air. Good luck heating that with pride, Nora. Nora did not answer him. She'd learned a long time ago that Dale wanted an answer. He wanted a flinch. He wanted something he could repeat later at the diner. She gave him nothing. She kept her hands folded and her eyes on Greaves. When the old man passed her the single sheet of paper, naming the tower hers, she folded it in half, then in half again. She put it in her coat pocket like it weighed nothing at all. It weighed everything. Her grandfather, Earl Kessler, had died 6 weeks earlier. A stroke. Fast and clean. It took him standing up in his own kitchen with a coffee cup still in his hand. He was 71. He had spent 40 years as the fire lookout on Kestrel Ridge, the last human eyes the Forest Service kept on that stretch of Montana. Then somebody in an office decided cameras could do the job cheaper. He had raised Nora from the time she was 9, after her mother, his daughter, died of an aneurysm. A Tuesday morning. Nora still could not talk about it without her jaw going tight. Earl never talked about that morning either. He just started teaching her things. How to read a firefinder. How to coil a rope so it wouldn't kink. How to keep a wood stove burning through a whole Montana night without wasting a single match. Matches cost money. Cold mornings were free. She used all 3 of those things in the first month after he died. None of them in the courtroom. In the courtroom, the only tool that mattered was silence. She had that one too. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Dale caught up to her. He had a way of walking that took up more sidewalk than his body needed. "No hard feelings," he said. "It's just numbers, Nora. Somebody had to get the house. Somebody had to get the truck. You got a tower nobody's climbed in 3 years." "I know what I got," Nora said. "Do you?" Dale smiled the way he always smiled when he thought he was being generous. County's going to condemn that thing inside a year. Salvage crew'll strip the steel. Sell the copper wire. "I already talked to a man about it, matter of fact. Offered $4,000 for the metal." Nora looked at him then. Really looked. The way Earl used to look at a column of smoke before deciding if it was a controlled burn or the start of something bigger. "It's not for sale," she said. "It's condemned," Dale said. "Nobody's asking you." He walked back to Carol's car, the one that used to be Earl's. Nora stood on the courthouse steps a long time after they drove away. She had $40 in her checking account, a backpack, a bus pass, and a key on a leather cord that Greaves had handed her along with the deed, a key Earl had worn around his own neck every day she had ever known him. She had never once, in 8 years of summers at that tower, been allowed up the last flight of stairs to the cab. Earl always stopped her at the landing below. "Not yet," he'd say. "When it's time, you'll know." She had assumed, the way children assume things, that time would come with some kind of announcement. A birthday, a graduation. Instead it came with a gavel, and a laugh and a courthouse parking lot. Nora understood, standing there with the deed folded in her pocket, that the time Earl meant had already started. Whether she felt ready or not, she did not go to the tower that week. She could not. Dale and Carol changed the locks on the house 2 days after the reading. They boxed up what little of Nora's things they didn't want. They left the boxes on a neighbour's porch with a note saying she could pick them up whenever. Nora picked them up that same afternoon. She walked the 4 miles to Walt Simmons's cabin at the edge of town. She knocked on a door she had only ever knocked on with her grandfather standing beside her. Walt Simmons was 74, built like a fence post. His voice came out low and slow, like it had all the time in the world. He had worked the tower, one district over from Earl, for 30 years, back when the Forest Service still kept 2 sets of eyes on Kestrel Ridge instead of none. He opened the door. He looked at the boxes in her arms. He did not ask a single question. "Guest room's got a bed frame that squeaks," he said. "Otherwise it's yours as long as you need it." "I can't pay rent," Nora said. "Didn't ask you to." That was the whole conversation. Nora set her boxes down in a room that smelled like cedar and old coffee. That night, over canned stew and cornbread, Walt told her the first thing about her grandfather that wasn't a memory she already owned. "Your grandpa," Walt said, "was the only lookout on this whole district who never once complained about the pay. 40 years and I never heard him gripe about a nickel. Man saved everything he made. Never bought a new truck. Never took a vacation past Missoula. I used to think he was just tight-fisted." Walt paused. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, the way a man does when he's deciding how much truth to hand over. "Now I think he was building something. I just never asked him what." Nora did not sleep much that night. She lay in the squeaking bed frame. She thought about the key on the leather cord, still around her neck. She thought about the last thing Earl had ever said to her, 3 days before the stroke. He was standing on the tower's lower landing, hand on the rail, like he already knew something she didn't. The view was never the valuable part, he'd told her. Count the rungs, Nora Jean. She hadn't understood it then. She'd thought it was one of his riddles. The kind old lookouts told young girls to keep them curious on long, boring afternoons with no smoke on the horizon. She understood it a little more now, lying in the dark in a dead man's friend's guest room, turning that sentence over and over like a stone in her pocket. The next morning she walked the 2 miles out to Forest Service Road, 214, past the one traffic light in Bitterroot Hollow, past the turn-off where the pavement gave up and became gravel. The tower came into view above the tree line, black steel legs, a small square cab against a hard blue Montana sky. It looked smaller than she remembered, and taller than she expected. Both at once. The way things from childhood always do. At the base, a chain-link gate hung open on one hinge. A Forest Service sign, faded and peeling, read, "Decommissioned. No public access." Underneath it, in fresher paint, somebody had stenciled a second word, "Condemned." Nora stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long moment. The key was warm against her collarbone from her own body heat. She looked all the way up. 80 feet. She had never counted the rungs. She had climbed those stairs 100 times as a kid. Always stopped at the same landing. Always sent back down for water or wood before she reached the top. She put her hand on the first rail and started to climb. This time, for the first time in her life, nobody called her back down. She counted as she went. 1, 2, 3. It felt foolish at first, a habit borrowed from a dead man's last sentence. But by the 40th stair, her mind had gone quiet, the way it only goes quiet at altitude. The wind picked up. The valley opened below her in long green folds. She kept counting because counting was easier than thinking about the fact that Earl had built this exact number of steps on purpose. She was not alone up there for long. A truck engine, unmistakable, growled up the gravel road below. She looked down through the stair treads. Dale's flatbed pulled in behind the chain-link gate. 2 men in the bed with cutting torches and a coil of chain. "Nora!" Dale called up, cupping his hands. "Come on down. Salvage crew's got work to do." "It's not for sale," Nora called back. The same 3 words from the courthouse steps. This time her voice didn't shake at all. "Contract's signed," Dale shouted. "You don't own the salvage rights on condemned county structures. You own the dirt under it." I checked. He hadn't checked closely enough. Nora didn't know that yet either, but she knew enough to plant her feet on the landing, cross her arms, and look down at him the way Earl used to look at trespassers on his ridge. "Come back with a court order," she said. "Or don't come back at all." Dale's face went the colour of a man who had expected an easy afternoon. He said something to the 2 men in the truck bed, something Nora couldn't hear over the wind. After a minute of arguing among themselves, the truck backed out, spitting gravel, and rumbled back down the road. Nora watched it go until it was a dust trail and nothing else. Then she turned back to the stairs above her, the last 30 feet to the cab. The door Earl had welded shut with a hasp and a padlock she had never once, in 17 years, been allowed to open. She climbed the rest of the way. At the top, with the whole Bitterroot Valley spread out gold and green beneath her, she pulled the key out from under her collar. She fit it to the padlock. She felt it turn. The hasp swung loose. The door stuck for a second, swollen from years of weather. Then it gave with a groan that sent a startled swallow flapping out from under the eaves. Nora stepped inside the cab for the first time in her life. It was smaller than she'd pictured it. A single room, maybe 12 feet by 12. Windows on all 4 walls, the way a lookout needed them. A narrow cot along one side. A wood stove no bigger than a milk crate. Earl's old firefinder still bolted to its stand in the centre of the floor, the brass ring dulled with dust but not with rust. Everything smelled like cold metal and pine sap. Underneath that, faintly, her grandfather's pipe tobacco. A smell she hadn't caught in 6 weeks. It hit her harder than she expected. She stood in the doorway a long moment before she let herself move. On the little shelf above the cot sat a logbook, the same kind the Forest Service had used for 80 years. Canvas-bound, the pages gone soft at the corners from handling. Nora picked it up like it might come apart in her hands. The last entry was dated the morning Earl died. Clear skies over the ridge. Wind out of the northwest, light. Told Nora once more about the rungs. She still thinks it's a riddle. It isn't. Count them, Nora Jean. Count everyone. Her throat went tight. She sat down on the edge of the cot. The logbook lay open on her knees. She read it twice more before she trusted her own eyes. Count the rungs. She had counted. 80. She was almost sure of 80, though her mind had wandered near the top. She flipped back through the logbook's earlier pages. Years of them. Weather notes. Smoke sightings. The small, dry humour Earl had never let himself show out loud but let loose on paper. 12 degrees this morning. Coffee froze in the pot before I got to it, which I did not think was possible, and now know for a fact is. Near the very back, tucked into the gutter of the binding, she found a folded scrap of graph paper. On it, in Earl's blocky hand, a single line, 80 rungs, 34th from the bottom. Under the board, not in it. Nora went still. She got up. She walked to the cot and knelt beside it. The floor was tongue and groove pine, gone grey with age. She ran her fingers along the seams until she found one board that didn't sit flush, a hairline gap where the others were tight. She pressed. Nothing. She pressed harder, working her fingertips into the gap. The board gave at one end like it was hinged instead of nailed. It took her almost 10 minutes to work it fully loose. She used the edge of a rusted screwdriver from a coffee can by the stove, the same can Earl had kept screws and washers in since before Nora was born. When the board finally lifted free, dust sifted down into the crawl space below. She found a shallow cavity no bigger than a shoebox, lined with an old feed sack to keep the damp out. Inside sat a tin box, the kind that once held pipe tobacco, rusted at the seams but sealed tight with a strip of electrical tape, gone brittle with age. Nora peeled the tape back carefully. The lid stuck. She worked a fingernail under the rim. It popped free with a small metallic sigh. Inside, packed in neat paper rolls, were silver dimes. Dozens of them. Maybe more than dozens. Old ones worn smooth at the edges, the kind her grandfather used to say weren't worth their weight anymore, except to a collector who knew what he was looking at. Underneath the rolls of dimes lay a second thing, small and cold. A brass key. The shank was stamped with a number, 214, and beneath the number, 3 tiny letters she didn't recognise at first. BIS and L, Bitterroot Hollow Savings and Loan. She sat back on her heels, the tin box in her lap. She understood all at once that the key in the tin was not a key to anything in this tower at all. She didn't go straight to the bank. She wasn't 17 and stupid, whatever Dale thought of her. She knew enough about money and lawyers by now to know that showing up alone with a strange key and no paperwork was a good way to get turned away at the door. Or worse, have somebody at the bank call Dale before they called her. She needed somebody who'd known Earl, somebody the bank would believe. She hiked back down the 80 rungs with the tin box zipped inside her jacket, the logbook under her arm. She walked the 2 miles to Walt Simmons's cabin faster than she'd ever walked it before. Walt was on the porch, splitting kindling with the unhurried rhythm of a man who had all day and intended to use every minute of it. He set the axe down the second he saw her face. "You found something," he said. Not a question. Nora didn't answer right away. She sat down on the porch step. She opened the logbook to the last page and turned it towards him. Walt read it slowly, his lips moving slightly, the way some men's did when they were reading something that mattered. When he got to count them, Nora Jean, he went quiet for a long moment. Then he reached up and took his hat off. Nora had never once seen him do that indoors, or out, for any reason at all. "That's Earl's hand," he said. "No question. I've read enough of his logs over 30 years to know it blind." She showed him the tin, the dimes, the key stamped 214, and B, H, S, and L. Walt turned the key over in his fingers. Slow, careful. The way a man handles something he suspects is more important than it looks. "Bitterroot Hollow. Savings and loan," he said. "That's a safe deposit key, Nora. I'd bet the ranch on it. My daddy kept one just like it for 40 years. Same shape, same stamp. A safe deposit box." Nora said the words like she was testing whether they'd hold weight. "Grandpa had a bank box. Looks that way. Why would he hide the key up there? Why not just tell me?" Walt was quiet a moment. He turned the key over once more before handing it back to her. "Man like Earl," he said, "didn't believe in handing things over easy. He believed you had to earn the reach for something before it meant anything. I expect he figured if you climbed all the way up there and did the work, you'd already proved you were ready for whatever's waiting down at that bank." Nora looked at the key in her palm, small and cold, stamped with a number that had waited 17 years to matter. "There's more," Walt said. "Has to be. Earl Kessler never once in 30 years did anything by half. If he hid a tin of dimes and a bank key under a floorboard, he hid it there because the bank box holds the real weight. The dimes were just enough to point you toward the door." That night, back at Walt's cabin, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the logbook open in front of her. She read every page twice, hunting for anything else Earl might have buried in his own handwriting. She found small things. A note about repairing the stovepipe. A weather pattern he'd tracked for a full decade, comparing one August to the next like a man keeping score with the sky. And near the middle of the book, dated the year Nora turned 9, the year her mother died. A single entry that had nothing to do with weather at all. "Buried her today. Nora's coming to live with me. I don't know the first thing about raising a girl, but I know how to build something that lasts, starting an account tomorrow. Whatever this job pays, half goes in every month. Until she's grown. She won't know until she needs to." Nora read it 3 times before she could get a full breath in. "He started saving for me," she said out loud. To Walt, to the empty kitchen, to nobody in particular. "The year Mum died. He started that year." Walt didn't say anything. He just refilled her coffee, the way a man does when there isn't a word big enough for the moment. Nora didn't sleep again that night, not really. She lay awake turning the brass key over and over in the dark. She thought about 80 rungs, a tin of dimes, a line in a logbook that had been waiting 9 years to be read. Outside, the wind moved through Walt's pines the same way it moved through the trees on Kestrel Ridge. For the first time since the courthouse, since the laugh, since the gavel, Nora Kessler let herself believe, just a little, that her grandfather had never once left her with nothing. He'd left her a door. She just hadn't found the key that mattered yet. She was wrong about that too. She'd find out how wrong within the week. A key that opens a safe deposit box only tells you where to look. It never tells you, ahead of time, how much is waiting on the other side, or how badly somebody else in town wanted it to stay hidden. She went back up to the tower 2 more times that week. Once with Walt, once alone. The logbook had said, "Count the rungs and find the board." It hadn't said the board was the only thing worth finding. Nora had learned enough about her grandfather in 6 days to know he never built just one layer of anything. She started with the cab itself. Every plank. Every seam. She ran her palm along the walls the way she'd run it along the floor, slow and patient, feeling for a give that shouldn't be there. Walt sat on the cot and watched her work. He didn't offer help unless she asked for it. That was its own kind of respect. "He built this cab himself," Walt said after a while. "Whole crew came out to help with the tower legs back in the day, but Earl always did the cab interior alone. Said a man ought to know every inch of the place he sits with a rifle and a radio, waiting for the world to catch fire." Nora's hand stopped on the wall behind the wood stove. One section of panelling looked, on second glance, a hair too new compared to the boards around it. Not new, just newer. Maybe 10, 15 years newer. The grain was slightly different. The nail heads were slightly less rusted. Walt. He was up off the cot before she finished saying his name. She pressed the panel. It held firm at first, tighter than the floorboard had been, but when she worked her fingers along the top edge, she found a notch, small and deliberate, exactly wide enough for a fingertip. She hooked her finger into it and pulled. The panel swung outward on a hidden hinge, silent, like it had been oiled within the last year. It probably had. Earl Kessler was not a man who let anything under his care go dry and stiff. Not even a secret. Behind the panel sat a steel document case. Grey. The kind with a combination latch instead of a keyed lock. It was bolted into the tower's wall frame, so it couldn't be pulled free, even if somebody found it. "There it is," Walt said. Quiet. Almost reverent. Nora ran her fingers over the case's face. No numbers scratched anywhere on it. No obvious combination hidden in the logbook. Not that she'd noticed yet. Just a small brass plate on the front, engraved, worn but legible. "For Nora Jean, when she's ready." She sat down hard on the edge of the cot. "I don't have the combination," she said. "Logbook," Walt said. "Go back to the logbook." Man like Earl, he wouldn't lock a door and lose the key to it himself. He'd have left the answer somewhere close. Somewhere only you'd think to look. Nora pulled the canvas-bound book back out. She flipped through it again, slower this time, reading every margin note, every stray number scrawled next to a weather log. Near the very front, on the inside cover, in ink so faded she'd skipped over it twice already, she found 4 numbers. Small. Almost lost in the grain of the old paper. "Oh, 917. She frowned at it. Then it landed. September 17th. Her birthday. Her hands weren't steady when she dialed it into the case's combination latch, but the tumblers clicked into place clean, one after another, like the lock had been waiting 17 years for exactly this hand to turn it. The case opened. Inside, wrapped in a square of oiled cloth to keep the damp out, lay a second key, smaller than the first, stamped with a number, and, beneath it, the words, "Safe Deposit." Beneath that, a folded sheet of paper, a photocopy of a certified letter, dated 9 years earlier, addressed to the manager of Bitterroot Hollow Savings and Loan. Nora unfolded it with both hands. It named an account. A trust, technically, the letter called it. Set up under a transfer on death designation. The balance to be paid in full to one beneficiary upon presentation of identification and this letter. No court proceeding required. The beneficiary's name, typed plain and unmistakable at the bottom of the page, was Nora Jean Kessler. "Walt," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "There's an account. He set up an account 9 years ago." Walt took the letter from her hands. He read it twice, the way he'd read the logbook. He set it down on the cot beside her, like it might bruise if he held it too long. 9 years, he said. That's the year after your mum had passed, round about when he wrote that line in the logbook about starting to save. "Why 2 keys?" Nora asked. "Why the dimes? Why the tin? Why not just leave the letter and the safe deposit key together in one place?" Walt thought about that a long moment. He looked out the cab's window at the ridge falling away green and gold below them. "Because he wanted you to earn the second door too," he said finally. "Man built 2 locks on purpose. First one cost you 80 rungs and a floorboard. Second one cost you a little faith, working through a logbook full of weather notes to find 4 numbers hiding on the inside cover." He wasn't testing whether you were smart, Nora. He was testing whether you keep looking after. Most folks would have quit at the first tin of dimes. Nora looked down at the 2 keys in her palm. The first stamped 214, the second stamped with a different number entirely. She understood, sitting in the cab her grandfather had built with his own hands, that this was never really about a fire tower at all. It was about a man who had spent 9 years quietly making sure of something. No matter what happened to him, no matter who tried to take what was left, his granddaughter would never again be handed $1 and a laugh. Never again told that was all she was worth. She just didn't know yet how hard Dale would fight once he found out there was a second door. Bitterroot Hollow. Savings and Loan sat on the corner of Larch and Forth, a squat brick building from the 1950s. A hand-painted sign in the window advertised CDs at rates nobody had seen since before Nora was born. Walt drove her in on Thursday morning, his truck rattling over the same potholes it had rattled over for 20 years. He waited in the lobby while Nora walked up to the teller's window with 2 keys, a certified letter, and her school ID. 17-year-olds didn't carry driver's licenses yet, and she needed something with her name and her face on it. The teller, a young woman with a name tag that read Brittany, looked at the letter for a long moment. Then she excused herself and went to get the branch manager. The manager was a heavy-set man named Roland Pierce, mid-50s. He had the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had spent 30 years handling other people's money and learned not to react to any number, big or small, in front of a customer. He read the certified letter twice. He checked it against something in a filing cabinet behind the counter. Then he looked at Nora with an expression she couldn't quite read. "This is a legitimate transfer on death account," he said. "Your grandfather set it up 9 years ago. Everything's in order. I'll need to verify your identity formally, and then we can open the box." "Is it?" Nora started, and had to stop and start again. "Is there a lot in it?" "I don't need an exact number. I just want to know if I should sit down." Roland Pierce almost smiled. "Sit down," he said. The safe deposit box, when they finally got it open in the small back room with the vault door standing ajar, held a stack of documents Nora didn't fully understand at first glance. Statements from something called a Forest Service employee credit union, going back 9 years. Each one showed a modest, steady deposit, month after month. The kind of number that looked small on any single page and enormous once you added 18 of them together. There was also a folder marked Timber Easement, Kestrel Ridge. Inside it, papers Nora would need Roland's help to read properly, because the language was the kind lawyers wrote in on purpose to keep regular people out. What she understood, once Roland walked her through it slowly, patiently, was that Earl had also quietly purchased, over the years, a small easement on a stretch of timberland adjoining the tower's 1-acre parcel. A regional logging company had been leasing rights to that land for 2 decades. They'd been paying into an account Earl controlled the whole time. "Add the credit union balance to the easement's current buyout value," Roland said, tapping a column of numbers with one finger, "and you're looking at right around $210,000, Miss Kessler. Give or take." Nora did not say anything for almost a full minute. Walt, standing behind her, put a hand on her shoulder. Light, steady. The kind of touch that didn't ask anything of her. "He never took a vacation," Nora finally said. "He never bought a new truck. He wore the same coat for 15 years. I used to think it was because we were poor." "Man wasn't poor," Walt said. "Man was patient." Nora turned that word over in her mind the rest of the day. Patient. It fit better than any word she'd used for him before. Not thrifty, not stubborn. Patient. The way a man is patient who plants a tree he'll never sit under. They left the bank with copies of everything, the original staying secured until the estate paperwork could formally transfer the account. Nora walked back out into the Bitterroot Hollow. Sunlight feeling like the ground under her had shifted permanently, the way it does after a long fever finally breaks. She should have known better than to think Dale wouldn't hear about it. Bitterroot Hollow is a small town, the kind where a teller mentions something to her cousin over dinner, and by the next morning half the county has a version of the story. Most of it wrong, some of it close enough to be dangerous. By Saturday, Dale Pruitt was standing on Walt Simmons's porch, uninvited, his truck idling in the driveway like he expected this to be a short conversation. "Heard you went to the bank," Dale said. No greeting, no pretense. "Heard you found something up in that tower." "Heard wrong, probably," Nora said, standing in the doorway, Walt a step behind her. "Don't play games with me, Nora. I'm still your guardian." Anything that comes out of that estate, anything Earl left behind, technically runs through me until you turn 18. Walt's voice came low, and even from behind her shoulder. Technically it doesn't, Dale. Transfer on death accounts pass directly to the named beneficiary. No probate required, no guardian sign-off. You'd know that if you bothered reading anything besides the parts of the will that had your name on them. Dale's jaw worked. Nora watched something shift behind his eyes. The particular look of a man doing fast, ugly math. "That's not right," he said. "That can't be right. The lawyer would have told me." "The lawyer told you what was in the will," Walt said. "This isn't part of the will. This is a separate account Earl set up 9 years ago, outside of probate entirely, same as any other bank customer's allowed to do. Nothing illegal about it. Nothing that requires your permission." Dale looked at Nora for a long moment. For just a second, she saw something underneath the bluster, something closer to fear than anger. "I need that scrap money," he said. Quieter now, almost to himself. "The shop's behind on the lease. 11 grand behind. I signed that salvage contract because I needed the 4,000 for the metal. Now you're telling me there's 200 grand sitting in an account you got, and I got nothing." It was the first true thing Dale had said since the courthouse. Nora heard the whole shape of it settle into place. This was never really about the tower being worthless. Dale had known, or at least suspected, that Earl's careful, tight-fisted decades meant something. He'd grabbed the house and the truck and the savings fast, before anyone could ask too many questions. He needed the money more than he needed to look fair doing it. "That's not my problem, Dale," Nora said, and her voice didn't shake at all. "You should have thought about your lease before you laughed at me on the courthouse steps." Dale didn't have an answer for that. He got back in his truck. This time when he drove away, he didn't come back with a scrap crew. He came back 3 days later with a different kind of trouble entirely. The county clerk's office sent a letter to Walt's address, addressed to Nora. A petition had been filed to condemn the Kestrel Ridge Tower parcel as a structural hazard, citing the same salvage contract Dale had already signed. A hearing date was set, 2 weeks out. If the petition succeeded, the county would take possession of the parcel for demolition. The salvage rights would transfer to whoever held the existing contract. Nora's 1-acre inheritance, tower and all, would cease to exist before she ever got the chance to decide what to do with it. Nora read the letter twice at Walt's kitchen table. She set it down flat and looked up at him. "He's trying to take the tower out from under me before I can even finish sorting out the bank stuff," she said. "Looks that way," Walt said. "Can he do that?" Walt was quiet a moment, the particular quiet of a man who had lived in a small town long enough to know exactly how these things usually went, and exactly how rarely they went the fair way. "He can try," Walt said. "County board's not always careful about who they believe, especially when a grown man with a business shows up, talking louder than a 17-year-old girl, talking quiet. We've got 2 weeks. That's enough time if we use every day of it right." Nora looked back down at the letter, at the hearing date circled in the clerk's neat handwriting. She thought about 80 rungs, and a floorboard, and a hidden panel with her own name engraved on a brass plate. She understood that Earl hadn't built 2 locks because he expected an easy fight. He'd built 2 locks because he knew, better than anyone, exactly what kind of man Dale Pruitt was capable of becoming when money got tight enough. She just hoped 2 weeks was enough time to prove it. The first thing Nora did was go back to Roland Pierce at the bank. If there was one person in Bitterroot Hollow who understood exactly how the money moved, it was him. She needed him on her side before the hearing, not scrambling to explain things after. Roland listened to the whole story, the petition, the salvage contract, Dale's shop lease. He didn't interrupt once. When she finished, he pulled a legal pad toward him and started writing. "A county condemnation hearing isn't a courtroom," he said. "It's a board of 5 people, usually busy, usually looking for the fastest path to a decision that doesn't get them yelled at later. If Dale shows up with a signed salvage contract and calls the tower a hazard, and nobody shows up to say different, the board takes the path of least resistance and condemns it. That's how these things usually go, not because anyone's crooked, just because nobody pushed back hard enough." "So I pushed back," Nora said. "You push back with documents," Roland said. "Not just your say-so, the recorded deed showing the parcel's yours outright. A structural assessment, if you can get one, showing the tower isn't actually a hazard, just old and locked up, And I can write a letter on bank letterhead confirming the transfer on death account, and the timber easement are legitimate and predate any salvage contract Dale might have signed. That last part matters more than you'd think. If Dale signed a contract promising to sell salvage rights he never actually held free and clear, that's not just embarrassing for him. That could be its own kind of trouble. Nora hadn't thought about that angle at all. What kind of trouble? The kind where a man signs a contract for something he doesn't own, Roland said, and the other party finds out, and decides they don't much like being lied to either. That gave Nora an idea. She turned it over for 2 full days before she said it out loud to Walt. What if the scrapper finds out first, she said, over breakfast on the 3rd morning? Before the hearing, what if somebody just tells him the truth? That Dale doesn't actually hold clear salvage rights because the parcel, and everything on it, already legally belongs to me. Walt set his coffee cup down slow. That's a sharper move than I expected out of you, he said, and there was something like pride in it. Grandpa didn't raise a fool, Nora said. He just raised somebody quiet. She got the scrapper's name from the county's public contractor registry. A man named Kurt Danvers, who ran a salvage yard 2 towns over. She called him herself, not through Walt, not through a lawyer. Roland had told her that sometimes the plainest voice was the most convincing one. Mr. Danvers, she said, when he picked up. My name's Nora Kessler. I'm the one who actually owns the tower on Kestrel Ridge that you signed a salvage contract for with Dale Pruitt. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I was told the county was condemning that structure, Danvers said finally, told the current owners an estate in dispute. There's no dispute, Nora said. I have the recorded deed. I have a letter from Bitterroot Hollow Savings and Loan confirming it. Dale doesn't own the tower. He never did. He signed you a contract for salvage rights on a piece of property that isn't his to sell. Another pause. Longer this time. That's so, Danvers said, and his voice had gone from businesslike to something colder. You mind faxing me those documents? She did that same afternoon, from the library in town, using $2 in quarters and a fax machine that groaned like it hadn't been used in a decade. Kurt Danvers called back within the hour. Contract's void, he said. Man sold me rights he didn't hold. I don't do business with people who lie to me about title, Miss Kessler. You won't have any trouble out of my crew. It was the first clean win Nora had landed entirely on her own. No Walt standing behind her shoulder. No Roland's careful documents. Just her own voice and a fax machine. And the plain truth laid out flat. Something about it settled a little of the fear that had been sitting under her ribs since the hearing letter arrived. But a voided salvage contract wasn't the same as a voided condemnation petition. The hearing date was still circled in red on Walt's kitchen calendar, 11 days out and closing fast. She spent the following week doing the slow, unglamorous work Roland had described. She requested a structural assessment from an independent inspector, paying out of the credit union account, now legally hers. $31 in old habit still made her wince every time a number left her hand, even though the balance behind it had 6 figures now. The inspector, a dry, careful man named Preston, who'd spent 20 years assessing old Forest Service structures across the state, climbed the tower himself. He took photographs. He tested the steel. He delivered his verdict without much ceremony. Sound structure, he told her, standing at the base with his clipboard. Steel's original, galvanized, built to withstand fire-season winds that would flatten most modern construction. Cab's been maintained. Somebody's kept this place up far better than a condemned building usually looks. I'll put it in writing. This is not a hazard. This is a well-maintained historic lookout that happens to be locked up. Nora thanked him and watched him drive away. Then she climbed the 80 rungs one more time. Alone. She wanted, before the hearing, to sit for a while in the room her grandfather had built with his own 2 hands, the room that had held 2 locked doors and a stack of 9 years of quiet, patient love disguised as bank statements. She sat on the cot with the logbook open on her knees. She read the last entry again. Clear skies over the ridge. Wind out of the northwest. Light. Told Nora once more about the rungs. She still thinks it's a riddle. It isn't. Count them, Nora Jean. Count everyone. She thought about how many other things in her life she'd assumed were riddles when they were really just instructions. Patient and exact. Waiting for her to trust them enough to follow through to the end. Outside the cab's window, the valley stretched gold and green in the late afternoon light. Somewhere down there, in a courthouse 2 miles away, a board of 5 people was about to decide whether this view still belonged to her. She wasn't going to let them decide wrong. Not after everything Earl had built, to make sure she never had to stand in a room and be laughed at again. 5 days before the hearing, Walt knocked on Nora's door at the guest room with something in his hands she hadn't seen before. A shoebox. Old, the cardboard gone soft at the corners. "Been meaning to give you this," he said. "Kept meaning to, and kept putting it off, because I wasn't sure it was mine to hand over. But I figure if there's ever a right time, it's now, with everything else coming up to the surface." Inside the shoebox were photographs, dozens of them, black and white and faded colour both, spanning what looked like 4 decades. Earl at the tower, young, maybe 30, standing beside a woman Nora didn't recognise. Earl holding a baby that had to be Nora's mother. Earl, older, standing beside a teenage girl Nora realised with a jolt was her own mother, maybe 16, laughing at something out of frame. And near the bottom of the box, a photograph that stopped Nora cold. Earl, considerably younger, in a Forest Service uniform, standing next to another man in the same uniform. Both of them grinning, arms slung over each other's shoulders, the tower behind them half built, scaffolding still up around the legs. "Who's that with him?" Nora asked, tapping the second man. Walt was quiet a moment. "That's me," he said. 1968. The year they finished building Kestrel Ridge Tower. I helped him raise it, plank by plank, before I got my own post 1 district over. "You built it with him?" "Every board," Walt said. "Every rung you counted, I helped hammer in." That's part of why I never asked what Earl was building all these years, in that cab, behind that panel. I already knew the man well enough to trust that whatever it was built with the same care as everything else he ever touched. Nora looked back down at the photograph. 2 young men grinning in front of a half-finished tower that would still be standing, still holding its secrets, 57 years later. "There's something else," Walt said. His voice had gone careful, the way it did when he was about to hand over something heavier than usual. "Something I should have told you sooner, maybe. Your grandpa wasn't always a lookout, Nora. Before the Forest Service, before your mama was even born, Earl worked timber survey for the state. He walked every acre of Kestrel Ridge on foot, mapping boundary lines by hand, before anybody had the fancy equipment they use now. That's how he knew, better than any lawyer or developer that ever came sniffing around this county, exactly where every parcel line actually sat. That's how he knew, decades before anybody else thought to look, that the old boundary survey on this ridge had an error in it. A gap, a sliver of land between 2 recorded parcels that nobody owned on paper, even though everybody assumed somebody did. Nora sat very still. "What are you telling me, Walt?" "I'm telling you that timber easement Roland showed you at the bank," Walt said. "The one paying into Earl's account for 20 years. That's not just an easement on land Earl already owned outright. Your grandpa told me once, half drunk on his own porch. The one night in 30 years I ever saw him take more than 2 beers. That gap parcel, the sliver nobody owned on paper, sits smack in the middle of that timber lease. And Earl filed the paperwork to claim it. Quietly, years ago, before anybody else noticed it existed. So the timber company's been paying an easement," Nora said slowly, working it through, "on land they didn't know actually belonged to somebody. To Grandpa." "That's my understanding, yes." Nora sat with that for a long moment. The shoebox of photographs stayed open on her lap. She felt the whole shape of her grandfather's life rearrange itself one more time. He hadn't just been a careful man who saved every dollar. He'd been a man who understood land and paper and boundary lines better than anyone in 3 counties. He'd spent decades quietly using that knowledge to build a fortress around the one thing he cared about protecting, long after he was gone. "Does Dale know about the gap parcel?" she asked. "I doubt it," Walt said. "I only know because Earl told me himself, and I never told a soul, because it wasn't my secret to tell. But if the county's condemnation hearing digs deep enough into the property records, somebody's going to find that filing. Once they do, it's not just going to prove the tower's not a hazard. It's going to prove your grandfather owned considerably more of that ridge than anybody, including Dale, ever accounted for." This changed the shape of the coming hearing entirely. Nora understood it the way she'd understood the firefinder as a child. All at once, the whole picture snapping into focus. She wasn't just walking into that hearing to defend a tower. She was walking in to defend an inheritance considerably larger than anyone, including her, had realised 6 weeks ago. She spent the next 4 days with Roland Pierce and a title researcher he recommended, a sharp, patient woman named Deborah Voss. She spent 2 full days at the county recorder's office, pulling survey maps and old boundary filings, until she found exactly what Walt had described. A gap parcel, 11 acres, filed and claimed by Earl Kessler 22 years earlier. Sitting entirely inside the boundaries of the land the logging company had been leasing and paying easement fees against for 2 decades. Fees that had, all along, been flowing into an account controlled by a man everyone in town assumed was barely getting by. "Your grandfather," Deborah told her, laying the survey maps out across Roland's conference table, "found a hole in a 100-year-old boundary survey. 3 generations of county surveyors missed it. He claimed it legally and quietly. Then he let a logging company pay him rent on it for 22 years. He never told anyone, including you, until he built you a locked room to explain it in." "Why not just tell me while he was alive?" Nora asked, and it wasn't really a question for Deborah. It was a question she'd been asking the empty cab of the tower every time she climbed up there alone. Walt, sitting beside her, answered it anyway. Because a girl who knows she's got $230,000 and 11 acres of timber rights waiting on her 18th birthday might stop reaching for things herself, he said. Might wait around for the inheritance instead of building her own 2 hands into something. Earl wanted you to grow up believing you had nothing. So you'd learn, same as he did. Nothing's ever really nothing, if you're willing to climb high enough to look for what's hidden in it. Nora didn't have an answer for that. Not right away. She just looked down at the survey map, 11 acres shaped like a crooked sliver of pie, sitting quiet and unclaimed for 100 years, until one careful, patient man decided to go looking for what everybody else had missed. The hearing was 2 days away now. For the first time since the courthouse and the laugh and the gavel, Nora Kessler walked into a room feeling like the ground under her feet was solid, deeded, and entirely, unmistakably hers. A week before the hearing, Dale did the one thing Nora hadn't anticipated. He hired a lawyer of his own, a sharp young attorney from Missoula named Griffin Okafor, who specialized in estate and boundary disputes. He showed up at Walt's cabin unannounced on a Tuesday evening, a folder of his own in hand. "Mr. Pruitt has retained me to review the estate settlement," Okafor said, standing on the porch, polite but pointed. "Specifically, the gap parcel claim your title researcher uncovered. We believe there may be grounds to contest it." Walt didn't invite him in. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, blocking the frame the way a much younger man might have. "On what grounds?" Walt asked. "The original 1962 boundary survey," Okafor said, "which Mr. Kessler's claim relies on being flawed, was conducted by a licensed county surveyor. Overturning a licensed survey 22 years after the fact, based on one man's private filing, is not as simple as your side seems to believe. We intend to argue the gap parcel claim is invalid, and that the land in question should revert to the adjoining leaseholder. That would substantially reduce the value of what Miss Kessler is claiming." Nora, standing behind Walt in the hallway, felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd let herself believe these last few days that the fight was mostly over, that the hearing would simply confirm what she already knew to be true. Okafor's calm, professional voice reminded her that money this size never came without somebody, somewhere, deciding to test how hard she'd fight to keep it. "You'll have our response through Mr. Pierce's office," Walt said. He shut the door, gently but firmly, before Okafor could say anything else. Inside, Nora sat down hard at the kitchen table. Can he actually do that? Undo the whole gap parcel claim? Walt didn't answer right away. That frightened her more than any answer would have. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I'm not a lawyer, Nora. I know timber and I know fire towers, and I know your grandfather about as well as any man alive. But boundary law 22 years deep, that's past what I can promise you an answer to." They called Roland first thing the next morning. Roland, in turn, brought in Deborah Voss, whose 2 days combing the county recorder's office had turned into what was starting to look like a small, unpaid crusade on Nora's behalf. "Let him try," Deborah said, when she heard about Okafor's threat, and there was something almost eager in the way she said it. I didn't just find the filing, Nora. I found the field notes. Earl didn't just claim that gap parcel on a hunch. He resurveyed the boundary himself by hand, using the same methods the original 1962 survey should have used and didn't. I found his original measurement log in the county archive, cross-referenced against 3 separate landmark stones still standing on the ridge today. His numbers check out. The 1962 survey's numbers don't. There's an 11-acre gap because the original surveyor made an arithmetic error, walking the boundary. Your grandfather was patient enough and precise enough to catch it and file the correction himself, properly, through the State Land Office 22 years ago. So Okafor's wrong, Nora said. Okafor's client is desperate, Deborah said. That's different from being right. But desperate men sometimes drag things out anyway, hoping the other side runs out of money or patience first. We need to make sure the board sees Earl's original field notes at the hearing, not just the filing. Numbers convince people. Handwritten proof of careful work convinces them faster. They spent the remaining days before the hearing preparing for a fight that might not even happen. There was no way to know. Not until Dale and his new lawyer actually stood up in that hearing room. Was Okafor's threat a real legal strategy, or just a last, desperate card? A man watching his business and his pride collapse in the same 6 weeks might play either one. Nora climbed the tower one more time during that stretch. Alone in the late afternoon, she sat in the cab with Earl's logbook open on her knees, rereading every entry, searching now not for a hidden key or a combination, but for something steadier. Some sense of her grandfather's own certainty. The certainty that had let him spend 22 years sitting on a legal claim nobody else knew existed, trusting that the truth, properly documented, would hold up whenever it finally needed to. She found it near the middle of the book, an entry from the same year as the gap parcel filing. Filed the correction today. State Land Office was surprised anybody still checked survey math by hand. Told them somebody taught me a boundary line only means something if you can prove it stood where you say it stood. That was my own father's words, and now they're mine. And someday, if she needs them, they'll be Nora's too. She read that line 4 times before she trusted herself to close the book without crying. 3 days before the hearing, Carol Pruitt called Walt's landline, of all things, and asked if Nora would come to dinner. Just the 2 of them, she said. No Dale. A chance to talk woman to woman before things got any more complicated than they already were. Nora almost said no. Walt watched her weigh it at the kitchen table, turning the phone cord around one finger the way she did when she was thinking hard about something. Might be worth hearing what she wants, Walt said. Doesn't cost you anything to sit at a table and listen. Just don't sign anything, and don't say more than you mean to. Nora went. Carol had set the table with the good plates, the ones Nora remembered from holidays when her mother was still alive. For a strange, disorienting moment, sitting in the dining room of the house that used to be Earl's, Nora felt 7 years old again instead of 17. I know how this looks, Carol said, once the roast was served, and the silence had gone on a beat too long. Dale getting the tower condemned. All of it. I want you to know I didn't push for any of that. You didn't stop it either, Nora said. Carol's hands went still on her napkin. No, she admitted. I didn't. Why not? It was the question Nora had been carrying since the courthouse steps. She watched it land on Carol like a weight she'd been expecting for weeks and dreading anyway. Because the shop is everything we have, Carol said finally. Dale built that business from nothing, and if it goes under, we lose the house too, the one we're standing in right now. I know that's not your problem. I know that's not fair to put on a 17-year-old. But I've spent 11 years watching my husband work himself sick, trying to keep that place afloat. When the estate came through and the numbers didn't add up in our favour, I let myself believe the tower really was worthless. Believing anything else meant admitting we'd taken more than we needed and left you with nothing at all. Nora set her fork down. You didn't leave me nothing, she said. There was no triumph in her voice, just plain fact. Grandpa made sure of that a long time before either of us knew it. You just didn't know what you were looking at when you decided the tower was the losing hand. Carol was quiet a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had gone smaller. Is it true? She asked. What people are saying? That there's real money in it, not just sentiment. There's real money in it, Nora said. More than the house, the truck, and the savings account put together. Carol closed her eyes briefly. Nora watched something complicated move across her face. grief and shame, and something that might, given enough time, become genuine regret. "I'm not asking you for any of it," Carol said. "I want to be clear about that. I just needed to know if we'd been as wrong as I've been afraid we were." "You were," Nora said gently, "because there was no version of the truth that would make it kinder, only versions that made it crueler." She had decided somewhere on the walk over that she didn't want to be cruel even to people who had earned it. But being wrong isn't the same as being finished, Carol. Dale's still got 2 days before the hearing to decide whether he wants to keep fighting a battle he's already lost or start figuring out how to fix the least problem the honest way. She left before dessert. She walked back to Walt's cabin in the cold with her hands in her pockets. She didn't know yet whether anything she'd said would change what Dale did at the hearing. She only knew that she had gone into that house expecting to defend herself, and had come out instead having said the truest, calmest thing she'd said to either of them in 6 weeks. That felt, in its own quiet way, like its own kind of victory. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She sat at Walt's kitchen table with all the documents spread out in front of her. The recorded deed, Preston's structural assessment, Roland's letter on bank stationery, Deborah's survey findings on the gap parcel, and the certified letter naming her as beneficiary of an account that had quietly grown for 9 years, while nobody but Earl knew it existed. Walt sat across from her, not saying much, just keeping her coffee cup filled, the way he had every night since she'd shown up on his porch with a box of her own things and nowhere else to go. "You scared?" he asked, somewhere close to midnight. "A little," Nora admitted. "Dale's going to be there. Carol too, probably. And a board of 5 people who don't know me from anybody. I have to stand up and explain all of this without sounding like I'm making it up as I go." "You're not making anything up," Walt said. "You've got paper for every word of it. That's the difference between you and Dale tomorrow. He's got a story he's telling because he needs it to be true. You've got documents because it already is true. Those aren't the same kind of confidence. A board that's paying attention can usually tell the difference, even when they don't say so out loud." Nora looked down at the stack of papers, then back up at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Why'd you take me in?" "That first night, you didn't even ask what happened. You just said the guest room was mine." Walt was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup the way he always did when deciding how much to say. "Because 30 years ago," he said, "my own wife passed. I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. The whole county figured I'd lose my post inside a year. Your grandfather showed up at my door with a truck full of firewood. He never said a word about it. Just stacked it by my porch and drove off before I could even thank him. Man did that kind of thing his whole life and never once expected credit for it. When you showed up on my porch with your boxes, I figured the least I could do was be the kind of man Earl Kessler already was." Nora didn't trust her voice enough to answer that right away. She just nodded, and Walt nodded back, and that was enough between them. The morning of the hearing came up clear and cold. The kind of Montana morning where the mountains look close enough to touch, even from 20 miles away. Nora dressed carefully. Not fancy, just clean and pressed. Roland had told her that a county board responds to a person who takes the moment seriously, and she wanted, more than almost anything else in her life so far, to be taken seriously. The hearing room in the Larch Street courthouse was smaller than the room where the will had been read, 6 weeks and a lifetime ago. 5 folding tables were arranged in a shallow arc for the board members, a single podium facing them. Dale was already there when Nora arrived, in a collared shirt that looked freshly ironed for the occasion. Carol beside him in pearl earrings. Griffin Okafor seated beside them both, his folder squared neatly on the table. All 3 of them wore the particular confidence of people who believed the outcome was already decided in their favour. Dale caught Nora's eye across the room and gave her a small, tight smile. The kind that wasn't really a smile at all. "Still time to save everybody the trouble," he said. "Low just for her. Sign the parcel over, take a fair cut of the scrap value, and this whole thing goes away quiet." "It already went away quiet," Nora said. "Kurt Danvers voided your contract 2 weeks ago. Might want to check your mail." Something flickered across Dale's face. Fast. Then the board chair called the hearing to order, and there wasn't time for anything else. Dale spoke first, the way petitioners usually did. He laid out his case in the plain, confident language of a man who had told this particular story to himself so many times he'd started to believe every word of it. The tower was a hazard. It had sat unused and unmaintained for years. The estate was in dispute, the ownership unclear. The county had both a right and an obligation to condemn a structure that posed a risk, especially with a minor listed as the nominal owner and no responsible adult managing the property. He was good at it. Nora had to give him that. He sounded reasonable, even generous, right up until you checked his math against the truth. When it was her turn, Nora walked to the podium with a folder of documents in her hands. For just a second, standing there with 5 strangers looking at her, she felt 17 in the smallest, most exposed way. She thought of Earl and the 80 rungs. He had built this whole path for her, one careful step at a time. He trusted she would climb it when the moment came. She climbed it. She thought, walking up to that podium, about the firefinder bolted to the cab floor. The brass ring Earl had taught her to read before she was tall enough to see over it without standing on a crate. He used to say a good lookout never guessed at a fire's location. You took your bearing, you checked it twice, and you called it in exact. A wrong number sent men and trucks to the wrong ridge while the real fire kept eating timber. Nobody was watching. She understood, standing at that podium with a folder of documents instead of a firefinder, that this was the same skill wearing a different coat. Precision. Say the true thing, say it exact, and let the number do the convincing instead of your nerves. "My name is Nora Kessler," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "The tower on Kestrel Ridge is not a hazard. I have an independent structural assessment, completed 8 days ago by a licensed inspector with 20 years of experience assessing Forest Service structures across this state. It confirms the steel frame is sound and the cab has been actively maintained." She set Preston's report on the podium and slid a copy toward the board chair. "I also have the recorded deed naming me as sole owner of the 1-acre parcel, issued at the time of my grandfather's estate settlement 6 weeks ago, with no dispute or ambiguity of any kind." She kept going, laying each document down in order, the way Roland had coached her, letting the paper do the talking instead of her own nerves. The bank's letter confirming the transfer on death account predated any salvage contract by 9 years. Kurt Danvers's written confirmation that he had voided his contract with Dale Pruitt upon learning Dale did not hold clear title to the salvage rights he'd signed away. And last, Deborah Voss's survey findings on the gap parcel. The 11 acres Earl Kessler had legally claimed 22 years earlier, sitting quiet and unclaimed by anyone else on record, now confirmed as part of the same estate, under dispute. Griffin Okafor rose before Nora had even finished, folder in hand. "If the board will indulge me," he said, "my client has retained me to contest the validity of that gap parcel claim, on the grounds that it relies on overturning a licensed 1962 boundary survey." Deborah Voss, sitting in the gallery beside Roland, was on her feet, almost before Patricia Ammon could respond. "With respect," she said, "I'd ask the board to review the original field notes, not just the filing." She handed forward a folder of her own. It was thick with photocopied ledger pages. In a careful, spare hand Nora now knew, as well as her own. Earl Kessler resurveyed that boundary himself in the year of his filing, using 3 landmark stones still standing on Kestrel Ridge today. His measurements, cross-checked against those same stones 2 weeks ago, are accurate to within 4 inches. The 1962 survey contains an arithmetic error in the northeast transect here. She pointed. An error Mr. Kessler caught, corrected, and filed properly through the State Land Office 22 years ago. This isn't a contested claim, Mr. Okafor. It's a documented correction to somebody else's mistake. Okafor studied the field notes for a long moment. Nora watched the same fast, ugly math cross his face that had crossed Dale's a week earlier. A lawyer recalculating the odds of a fight he no longer had the numbers to win. "I'll need time to review this properly," he said more carefully now. "You'll have it," Patricia Ammon said. "But this board isn't ruling on the gap parcel today regardless. Today we're ruling on a condemnation petition, and Mr. Okafor's boundary dispute, whatever its merits, doesn't change whether that tower is a structural hazard, which it plainly is not." Okafor sat back down. Dale's collared shirt suddenly looked a size too tight around the neck. Preston, the structural inspector, rose next when the board asked if anyone wished to corroborate the assessment. He was a plain, unhurried man, not given to flourish. He spoke for less than 2 minutes, but every word landed like a hammer finding a nail square. "I've assessed 11 Forest Service lookout towers in this state, over 20 years," he said. "Half of them, Structures far younger than Kestrel Ridge I've recommended for demolition. This one, I did not. The steel is original 1968 galvanized stock, still within tolerance. The cab has been weatherproofed and maintained within the last several years by someone who plainly knew what they were doing. In my professional opinion, calling this structure a hazard isn't just inaccurate, it's the opposite of what any competent inspector would conclude standing where I stood. He sat back down without waiting to be thanked, the way a man does when he considers the truth, its own kind of closing statement. The board chair, a woman named Patricia Ammon, who had clearly seen 100 of these hearings and rarely looked surprised by any of them, actually set down her pen. "Miss Kessler," she said, "are you telling this board something specific? That the petitioner filed a condemnation request against a structurally sound building, based partly on a salvage contract he no longer holds valid claim to?" "Yes, ma'am," Nora said. Patricia Ammon looked over at Dale, who had gone quiet in the particular way of a man realizing every card he'd been counting on had already been played and lost. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "is that an accurate characterization?" Dale opened his mouth, and for a moment nothing came out at all. Patricia Ammon waited, unhurried, the way people do when they already suspect the silence is its own answer. "Mr. Pruitt," she said again, "this board would like a direct response. Did you file this petition knowing your salvage contract, the stated basis for calling the structure economically unviable to maintain, had already been voided?" "I found out after I filed," Dale said finally. "I didn't withdraw it because I still believed the structure itself was a hazard, separate from the contract." "Yet you have offered this board no independent assessment supporting that claim," Patricia Ammon said, "while Miss Kessler has offered one from a licensed inspector with 20 years in this exact specialty. Do you have any technical basis for calling this tower a hazard, Mr. Pruitt, beyond it being locked and unused for several years?" Dale glanced at Okafor, who did not look up from his folder. Nora understood, watching that small telling glance, that even Dale's own lawyer had stopped believing in the argument he'd been paid to make. "No," Dale said, quieter now. "No technical basis, just that it sat empty a long time, and empty buildings fall apart eventually." "Eventually is not now," Patricia Ammon said, "and this board does not condemn structures on the basis of eventually. We condemn them on the basis of documented, present hazard, which you have not shown, and Miss Kessler's assessment directly contradicts." Dale's attorney tried once more, leafing quickly through his folder. "The board should note," Okafor said, "that the timing here is suspicious. A structural assessment commissioned 8 days before a condemnation hearing by the very person contesting that hearing isn't exactly independent. Preston Assessments has no financial relationship with Miss Kessler beyond the standard inspection fee," Patricia Ammon said, checking a line on her own notes, "which, I'll note, she paid in full. On time, the same as any other citizen commissioning an assessment ahead of a hearing she'd been given 2 weeks' notice to prepare for." "That's not suspicious, Mr. Okafor. That's diligence. I'd ask you to reserve objections for matters this board hasn't already reviewed twice." Okafor sat down without another word. Nora felt for the first time all morning something like the ground steadying fully beneath her. Roland Pierce, who had come to sit in the small gallery of folding chairs at the back of the hearing room, cleared his throat and raised a hand. "If the board will permit," he said, "I can speak to the financial history of the estate, as branch manager of the institution holding the relevant accounts." Patricia Ammon nodded him forward. Roland stood, buttoned his jacket, and spoke plainly, the same unhurried, careful way he'd spoken to Nora across his own desk 2 weeks earlier. He confirmed the transfer on death account, the 9 years of deposits, the timber easement, and, at Nora's nod, the gap parcel Deborah Voss had confirmed at the county recorder's office. He laid out in plain dollar figures that Earl Kessler's total estate, once every account and every parcel was properly accounted for, exceeded $230,000, a figure that dwarfed the house, the truck, and the modest savings account Dale and Carol had already claimed and, by all appearances, already spent. $230,000, Patricia Ammon repeated, looking directly at Dale now. "And you filed a petition to condemn and demolish it, a structure holding a locked steel case with legal documentation of that estate, based on a salvage contract you no longer legally held, 4 days after your granddaughter's own scrap crew tried to force entry onto that same property without a court order." "I didn't know about the case," Dale said. His voice had gone thin. "I didn't know any of this. I just knew the shop was behind on the lease, and the tower looks like the fastest thing to turn into cash. It was, Nora realised listening to him, the most honest sentence Dale Pruitt had said in 6 weeks. It hadn't come from any decency. It had come from getting caught. The shop is $11,000 behind, Nora said, quiet. Not cruel, just factual. The way Earl would have said it. That's what this was always about. Not the tower being worthless. You needed money fast, and you gambled that a 17-year-old girl with a rusted fire tower wouldn't be able to stop you before the bank came calling on your lease. Carol Pruitt, silent until now, reached over and put a hand on Dale's arm. Oh, for the first time since the will reading, Nora saw something other than smugness cross Carol's face. It looked unmistakably like fear. Patricia Ammon conferred briefly with the other 4 board members, a short, murmured exchange Nora couldn't fully hear. Then she looked back up. This board finds no basis for condemnation, she said. The structure is confirmed structurally sound by independent assessment. Title is clear and uncontested. The petition appears to have been filed on the basis of a salvage claim the petitioner no longer legally holds. And possibly, she added, glancing at Dale, without full disclosure of that fact to this board. The petition is denied. The county will note in the record that any future filing regarding this parcel should be reviewed for good faith before a hearing is scheduled. It wasn't a dramatic gavel. It wasn't a courtroom scene from a movie. It was 5 tired county officials and a folding table. And it was, Nora understood, sitting very still in her chair, while the words settled over her, the single most important sentence anyone had said to her in 6 weeks. The petition is denied. Dale didn't look at her on his way out. Carol did for just a second, and there was something in her face that might have been the beginning of shame, though Nora didn't trust it enough yet to call it that. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Walt found her standing very still, looking out at the mountains. These were the same steps where Dale had laughed at her 6 weeks earlier, the same steps where he'd told her good luck heating a tower with pride. You did that, he said. All of it. I just drove the truck. You did more than drive the truck, Nora said. Maybe, Walt allowed. But climbing 80 rungs, finding 2 locked doors, and standing up in front of 5 strangers with your voice steady the whole way through, that part was all you, Nora Jean. She let herself cry a little. Then, finally, 6 weeks of held-tight grief and fear and careful, patient work broke loose all at once on a courthouse step in the cold Montana air. Walt didn't say anything. He just stood beside her and let her, the way a good man does when there's nothing left to fix and the only thing left to offer is company. But there was still one more thing left undone, and Nora knew at the moment her breathing steadied. There was still a tower up on Kestrel Ridge. It hadn't held a light in its lamp room since the Forest Service automated the district, since they pulled the last human lookout off the ridge for good. She wanted, more than she'd wanted, almost anything in 6 weeks, to see it lit one more time. The weeks that followed moved the way slow procedural things move, quietly and mostly on paper. The county recorder's office confirmed the gap parcel claim, once Deborah's field notes and Earl's original survey math were formally entered into the record. The timber company's lease was amended within a month to reflect the corrected boundary. Back payments on the 11 acres began to route directly into an account under Nora's name, managed jointly with Roland's bank until she turned 18. Griffin Okafor withdrew his boundary challenge in writing 2 weeks after the hearing. A short, professional letter that conceded the field notes were, in his words, dispositive. Roland walked Nora through every piece of it, patient the way he'd been from the first afternoon at his desk. He made sure she understood, not just what had happened, but why each document mattered, so that nobody, ever again, could hand her a folder of paperwork and count on her not reading it closely. She would always know the difference between a real claim and a bluff. Your grandfather built this whole structure so it would survive without him standing here to explain it, Roland told her, the day the gap parcel confirmation came through the mail. That's rarer than people think, Nora. Most folks who save money just save money. He built a system, documents that corroborate each other, filed in different places, so no single lost paper or single liar could ever undo the whole thing at once. He was a lookout, Nora said. 40 years of watching for the one thing that could burn everything down if you missed it. I think that's just how his mind worked by the end. Watch everything. Assume somebody's going to come for it eventually. Build so the fire can't take it all at once. Roland didn't have an answer for that, Just a nod. The kind that said he understood exactly what she meant. He mailed her a small gift a week later, unprompted. A blank logbook, canvas-bound, the same style as Earl's. No note attached. He didn't need to explain it, and Nora didn't need him to. She started her own first entry that same night, at Walt's kitchen table, in handwriting that already looked a little like her grandfather's. Clear skies over the ridge tonight. Learning to keep a record. Grandpa would say that's half the job. The other half, he'd say, is just showing up. Every single day, without fail. Rain, shine, or smoke on the ridge. Dale's auto shop did not survive. The lease came due. The $11,000 was never found. The shop closed its doors in October, the same month the first hard frost hit Bitterroot Hollow. Nora heard about it from Walt, who heard about it from half the town, the way news like that always travelled faster than anyone wanted it to. She thought, when she heard, that she might feel something like satisfaction. Instead, she felt mostly tired. The particular tiredness of a long fight finally ending, without anyone left standing in triumph. Only people left standing. Period. Carol called her once more, in November. Not to ask for anything this time, just to tell her that she and Dale were separating. The shop's collapse had cracked something in their marriage that 6 weeks of quiet fear had already put under more pressure than it could hold. She didn't ask Nora for forgiveness. She only said, near the end of the call, "Your grandfather was a better man than either of us gave him credit for. I'm sorry it took all this for me to see it." Nora didn't offer forgiveness either. Not fully. Not yet. But she didn't hang up angry, and that felt for now like enough progress for both of them. She thought, after that call, about the dinner at the Good Plates, and about Carol's question, the one that had sat under everything else that night. Is it true, what people are saying, that there's real money in it? Nora understood now that the question had never really been about money at all. It had been about whether Carol could still believe she was a decent person, after taking what she'd taken. Nora had answered honestly, because lying about it, even gently, would have only let Carol keep believing a story that wasn't true. Some kindnesses she was learning looked like honesty instead of comfort, and cost you more in the moment to give. Walt still split kindling on his porch most mornings, unhurried, the same rhythm he'd had the day Nora first showed up with her boxes. Most mornings that first year, she was still there beside him with a second axe. Not because he needed the help, because the sound of two axes falling in rhythm had become for both of them its own kind of company. He never once brought up rent again, not in all the months she stayed. When she finally moved to her own place, he helped her carry boxes down the same porch steps where he'd once told her the guest room was hers without asking a single question first. "You gonna keep coming around?" he asked, setting the last box in her trunk, "now that you've got your own roof?" "Every Sunday," Nora said, "same as I used to sweep the tower, because somebody has to, and I'd rather it be somebody who wants to." Walt smiled at that, the small, rare smile of a man who didn't hand them out easily, and went back inside to finish his coffee. Nora used part of that first winter to finally open the unopened envelopes from Panhandle State Bank that had sat, unread in a drawer since before the will was even read. The last small stack of anxious paperwork from her old life she hadn't found the courage to face. They were nothing in the end. Overdraft notices from a checking account she'd closed months before Earl died. The kind of small, ordinary trouble that used to keep her up at night, and now, next to everything else, barely registered at all. She shredded them at the library's machine and walked out into the cold feeling lighter than she expected a stack of old paper to make her feel. Deborah Voss stopped by Walt's cabin twice more that winter, once to drop off a bound copy of the full survey file for Nora's own records. Once, unannounced, just to see how she was doing. Nora hadn't expected that from a woman she'd known for less than 2 months, but she'd come by then to think of Deborah as something close to family. "You know," Deborah said. The second visit, sitting at Walt's kitchen table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "I've worked boundary disputes for 11 years. Most of them are ugly. Neighbours who used to be friends, suing each other over 6 feet of fence line. This was the first one I've worked where the person who filed the original claim wasn't trying to take anything from anybody. He was trying to give something quietly 22 years before anyone would need it. That was Grandpa," Nora said. "Give quietly. Never take credit." "I noticed," Deborah said. "It's rare. I wanted you to know I noticed." Deborah stayed another hour that afternoon, longer than either of them expected. She told Nora about her own grandmother, a woman who'd raised 6 kids on a ranch outside Kalispell, and never once complained about the work. People like that don't leave a lot behind on paper, Deborah said. Mostly just what they built and who they built it for. Your grandpa left both. That's rarer than the money, if you ask me. I think about that, Nora said. What he built it for. Some days it feels like the same question. Maybe it is, Deborah said. She left before dark, promising to come back in the spring, once the roads cleared, to see the tower relit for herself. Dale himself she saw only once more that winter, at the hardware store on Larch Street, buying a single box of nails, alone in a coat that looked a size too big for him now. The confidence that used to fill it out had gone somewhere else. He saw her too. For a long moment neither of them said anything. I was wrong, Dale said finally. Quiet. Not performing it for anyone. About the tower. About you. I needed it to be worthless because I needed the money more than I needed to be fair. I told myself a story that let me believe both things could be true at once. I know, Nora said. I'm not asking for anything, Dale said. I just wanted to say it out loud once where you could hear it. Nora nodded, and let that be the whole conversation. Some doors only need to be opened part way. She had learned enough from a locked cab and 2 hidden keys to know that not every door has to swing all the way to mean something. She used a portion of the credit union balance, once it formally transferred into her name that winter, to pay off Preston's assessment fee and Deborah's research costs in full. Both of them had told her more than once they'd have done the work for nothing. She used another portion to enroll in the state's forestry technology program at the community college in Missoula. The closest modern equivalent, she figured, to the work Earl had spent his whole life doing by hand. And she used a small, specific portion, $4,000 exactly, the same figure Dale had once offered a scrapper for 80 feet of steel. She used it to fund a scholarship at Hollow Creek High for any graduating senior who'd lost a parent and needed help paying for their first semester somewhere. It was named, at Walt's quiet suggestion, the Earl Kessler Fund. The first recipient was a boy named Travis Odom, 17, who'd lost his father to a logging accident 2 years earlier and had been planning to skip college entirely to help support his mother. Nora handed him the check herself, at a small ceremony in the high school gym that nobody outside Bitterroot Hollow would ever hear about. When he asked her, awkward and grateful, why she'd picked him, she told him the truest thing she knew. Somebody did it for me first, she said. Turns out it's supposed to keep moving. Travis didn't fully understand what she meant. Not that day standing in a gym that smelled like floor wax and old varnish. A folded check in his hand, his mother crying quietly in the 3rd row. Nora didn't expect him to understand yet. She hadn't fully understood Earl's Enigma line either, the first time she heard it. She was 9 years old on the tower's lower landing. Her whole life was about to change, and she had no way to know it. Some things, she'd come to believe, you don't understand until years later. Not until you're the one standing at the top of your own set of stairs, finally able to look back down and see the whole shape of the climb. Travis wrote her a letter that spring, from his first semester at the state college. Awkward and earnest, the way of a boy still learning how to put big feelings into small sentences. He said the scholarship had let him keep his mother's car running. It let him pay for his own books without picking up a second job, one that would have cost him the grades he needed to keep the aid coming. He said he didn't know how to properly thank a stranger for that. Nora wrote back a short letter of her own. She told him he didn't owe her thanks, only that he pass it forward himself someday, to somebody he'd never met either. The Earl Kessler Fund gave out its second scholarship the following spring, this time to a girl named Priya Chandra, who'd lost both parents in a car accident on the pass road and was raising her younger brother alone at 19. Nora didn't attend that ceremony in person. She sent the check through the school, along with a short note. It said only somebody did this for me first. It's supposed to keep moving. The same 6 words she'd told Travis. Some sentences, once you've found the right shape for them, don't need improving. Only repeating, honestly, to whoever needs to hear them next. She kept working. That year and the next, splitting her time between the forestry program in Missoula and Bitterroot Hollow, where Walt's guest room stayed hers for as long as she wanted it. By her 2nd year, she'd saved enough carefully, the way Earl had taught her, without ever meaning to rent a small place of her own 2 streets over. She kept the tower too, filing the paperwork herself once she turned 18 to have it formally reclassified. Not as a decommissioned hazard, but as a private historic structure. Maintained, insured, and hers outright, free and clear of guardianship or dispute of any kind. The forestry program surprised her in ways she hadn't expected. Half the coursework was exactly what she'd assumed. Timber management, fire behaviour, the modern instruments that had replaced the firefinder. Earl bolted to his cab floor 60 years earlier. The other half was survey work, boundary law, the careful measuring of land, and the careful reading of old documents to see what previous surveyors had gotten right and what they'd gotten wrong. Her professor, a clipped, precise woman named Dr. Abernathy, noticed early on that Nora had a feel for the boundary law modules most of her classmates found dry. "You've got an instinct for this, Doctor," Abernathy told her after Nora turned in a paper reconstructing a fictional boundary dispute with the same patient. Methodical logic Deborah Voss had used on the real one. "Most people either love the outdoors part or the paperwork part. You seem to actually enjoy both." "My grandfather did too," Nora said. "Took me 17 years to understand that. He was doing both his whole life. I just thought he was doing one." Dr. Abernathy asked her once why she'd chosen forestry over something with better pay. Nora thought about it a long moment before she answered. "Because the best thing anybody ever did for me," she said, "was walk a ridge on foot for 22 years, just to make sure nobody could take it from me later. Seemed like a good skill to learn myself, in case somebody else needs it someday." Dr. Abernathy didn't have a follow-up question for that. She just nodded, the way people did when Nora said something true enough that it didn't need any more words around it. She didn't tell Dr. Abernathy the whole story. Not that semester, not to a professor she'd known for 3 months. But she carried the shape of it with her into every survey assignment after that. She understood a little more each time why Earl had spent so many quiet years walking a ridge on foot, measuring it by hand. Easier tools were already available. Men with less patience than him used them. By her second year, she'd started volunteering weekends with the county surveyor's office. The same office that had once assessed Kestrel Ridge Tower at $1. She helped catalogue old boundary filings that had never been properly cross-referenced against modern GPS surveys. It was slow, unglamorous work, exactly the kind Earl would have approved of. Twice that year she found small discrepancies of her own, nothing as large as the gap parcel, but enough to earn her a standing invitation to keep coming back after graduation, if she wanted it. She wanted it. She hadn't expected to. The year the will was read and the tower felt like a joke, and a burden both at once. But somewhere in the climbing and the counting, somewhere in the careful, patient work of proving what was already true on paper, Nora Kessler had found something. The same thing Earl must have found decades earlier. Standing alone on a ridge with nothing but a firefinder and a job most people considered a lonely way to spend a life. She'd found a kind of quiet that didn't feel empty. It felt, instead, like the particular fullness of a person who finally understood exactly what she was for. She still thought about the courthouse laugh sometimes, usually at odd moments, standing in a survey field with a measuring wheel in her hand, or sitting in a lecture hall, taking notes on boundary case law. It didn't sting the way it used to. It had become, instead, something closer to a marker, a line on a map, showing exactly how far she'd travelled, since the day a man told her good luck heating a tower with pride. He believed wrongly that pride was the only thing she'd been left to keep her warm. Hollis Tatum, the old foreman 2 districts over whom Walt had once mentioned in passing, showed up at the tower unannounced one Saturday that second spring. He'd heard through the same slow small-town grapevine that had once carried Dale's business troubles across 3 counties within a week. He was older than Walt, walked with a cane now, but his eyes were sharp as ever when he looked up at the relit lamp in the cab window. "Earl talked about this place like it was a person," Hollis said, standing at the base of the stairs, craning his neck to take in the whole 80 feet of it. "Never understood why, not really, till just now, seeing it lit up again." "He built it to outlast him," Nora said. "I think that's the part I understand best now. Not the money, not even the ridge. Just that a person can build something so patient and so careful that it keeps working long after they're gone, taking care of the one person they loved enough to plan 17 years ahead for." Hollis nodded slowly, the nod of an old man recognizing, in a girl not yet 20, the same quiet steadiness he'd spent a whole career admiring in her grandfather. "He'd be proud of you climbing it," he said. "Every single rung." "I think about that," Nora said. "Whether he'd be proud. Some days I know it for a fact. Other days I just hope it's true." That's about right, Hollis said. Man like Earl never made it easy to tell. Kept his praise the same way he kept his money. Close to the vest and worth more than it looked. Nora walked Hollis part way up the stairs that afternoon. Slow, matching his cane's pace the same way she matched Walt's. At the landing where Earl always used to stop her as a child, Hollis paused to catch his breath and looked out at the valley for a long moment without saying anything at all. View hasn't changed, he said finally. 40 years and it hasn't changed one bit. He always said the view wasn't the valuable part, Nora said. No, Hollis agreed, but it's a fine thing to have all the same, once you've earned the right to stand here and look at it. They didn't climb the rest of the way that day. Hollis's knees weren't up for 80 rungs anymore, and Nora didn't push him, the same way nobody had ever pushed her before she was ready. They sat on the landing instead. Two people from two different generations of the same quiet, patient family Earl Kessler had built without ever using the word family out loud. They watched the light shift slowly across Kestrel Ridge, until the afternoon wore down into evening. The wind picked up cool off the far pines, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke from somewhere down in the valley. Neither of them felt any particular hurry to be anywhere else. She climbed it every few weeks after that, sometimes with Walt, sometimes alone. She kept the logbook going, the same canvas-bound style Earl had used for 40 years, filling its pages with her own weather notes and her own small, dry observations. Some habits, once you understand what they were really for, are worth keeping even after the reason for starting them has already been answered. In the spring, on the 1-year anniversary of Earl's death, Nora climbed the 80 rungs of Kestrel Ridge Tower one more time, this time with Walt beside her, both of them older by a season and a whole life's worth of paperwork. At the top, she opened the cab's door without needing the key at all anymore. The lock had been replaced with a simple latch the day the county confirmed her ownership for good. The climb felt different this time, not lighter, exactly. She still counted, out of habit, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 80. Some habits become part of a person, whether or not they still serve their original purpose. But where the first climb had carried fear and grief and the specific dread of not knowing what waited at the top, this one carried something closer to homecoming. The particular ease of walking a path you've walked enough times to trust with your eyes half closed. Walt climbed slower than he used to, 75 now. Nora matched her pace to his without either of them mentioning it. The way people who care about each other adjust their steps without needing to be asked. Halfway up, he stopped at the same landing where Earl used to stop her as a child, hand on the rail, catching his breath in the thin mountain air. Your grandpa stood right here, Walt said, more times than either of us could count, waiting on weather, waiting on smoke, waiting on you to grow up enough to climb the rest of it yourself. Think he knew how long it'd take? Nora asked. 17 years is a long time to wait on a plan. Man who spends 9 years quietly saving half his paycheck for a girl he's already raising, Walt said, isn't in a hurry about anything. He knew the waiting was the plan. Same as counting rungs is the plan. You don't skip steps just because you are eager to reach the top. They climbed the rest of the way together. At the top, the valley opened beneath them exactly the way it had the first time. Gold and green in the late spring light. The ridge ran out toward the horizon in long, unbroken folds. Earl had once walked every acre of it on foot, measuring it by hand, so that no one could ever quietly take it from his family. Not a developer, not a nephew's greed, not 100 years of careless paperwork. Inside, she kept everything exactly as she'd found it. The cot, the fire finder, the wood stove, the false panel, empty now, its steel case moved down to the bank for safekeeping. But the hinge Earl had built stayed oiled and silent when she opened it, out of habit, just to feel it move. She'd added one thing, a small brass lamp, salvaged and rewired by an electrician in town, set on the windowsill facing the valley. The same window where a Forest Service lookout would once have scanned for smoke on the horizon, every evening until dark. She lit it that night, for the first time since the district automated and pulled the last human eyes off the ridge. She stood at the window, with Walt beside her, watching the small warm light throw itself out over Kestrel Ridge and the whole gold-green valley below. He'd have liked this, Walt said. He built the whole thing so I'd get here, Nora said. The rungs, the panel, the letter with my name on it, all of it, so that someday I'd be the one standing at this window, not some camera on a pole. Walt didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Below them, the valley settled into evening, quiet and gold-edged, the way it had settled every evening for 80 years, watched or unwatched. Nora watched the lamp's light spread over the ridge, steady, unhurried, warm.